The Divergent Path of Aboriginal British Columbian Youth, a narrative presentation by Marquise Richards. In this presentation, we will be exploring a case involving both Aboriginal families and the Canadian government. While examining the specifics of this case, we will also consider the individuals involved, both the case's historical and legal context, as well as an in-depth opinionated view on the situation. This case outlines the issues occurring within British Columbia in regard to its child care spending model. The current spending model allocates funds for two categories: children of Aboriginal descent and those with a lack thereof. Current numbers show that children of Aboriginal descent are admitted into child care at a ratio of 17:1 when compared to children of non-Aboriginal descent. The current model, however, allocates more funds to agencies responsible for the well-being of non-Aboriginal children, indirectly creating a two-tiered system in which the children of non-Aboriginal descent are deemed the successor. The current model allows for contracts with 23 agencies province-wide. Numerically, the current model is stout. The flaw is noticed when these agencies are regulated to specific territories within the province. This model allows for area discrepancies and causes some agencies to become overworked. The excessive workload alongside the underfunded programming is a recipe for discriminatory distribution of federal funding. In the midst of the events occurring in British Columbia lay the two direct parties involved in the case of the unfair spending model. To begin, the British Columbian provincial government are the ones held responsible for the current child care spending model. This model, while feasible for the government, exploits child care agency workers, discriminates against Aboriginal families, and fails to meet both the orders issued by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. On the contrary, Bernard Richard, who is pictured on the left, is the British Columbian representative for children and youth. He is the individual responsible for bringing the injustice to light and ensuring the well-being of children within the province is intact. Bernard Richard accomplishes his goals while pursuing atonement for the government for both their present and past discrimination. Although not attributed with direct involvement in this case, Aboriginal families are involved and receive the repercussions of the government's created two-tiered system. When children are placed in government care, they are taken from their families. Although this might seem like the appropriate option, the process of placing children into government care is much more demanding than it may appear at first glance. When placed into government care, children are separated from their heritage. The cultural practices that one might have engaged in with their families is now a novelty. In addition to this, the current spending model allocates more funding for children of non-Aboriginal descent, which causes the living conditions for those of Aboriginal descent to be lacking the adequate resources needed to nourish a growing human. In the example given, 18-year-old Alex Gervais took his life while in government care after making multiple requests to move due to alleged sexual assaults and going unsupervised by multiple caregivers.
Canada from the 1960s to the late 80s, child welfare authorities scooped 20,000 Indigenous children from their families. Most of the children were adopted by white families. Many were taken without their mother's knowledge and sent to other provinces, the US, and even Europe. Authorities said they were acting in the children's best interests. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report stated the 60s scoop, quote, adversely affected parenting skills and the success of many Aboriginal families. Critics say it was a racist effort to assimilate Indigenous Canadians, and those who lived through it say they were robbed of their cultural identity. In 2015, the Manitoba government took responsibility.
I would like to apologize on behalf of the province of Manitoba for the 60s scoop.
But the federal government has never apologized. Today, survivors are bringing multiple lawsuits to courts across Canada.
It begins to the legal issues involved in this case. As explained in the previous video, the 60s scoop was a period in which Aboriginal children were scooped from their homes and families in order to assimilate them from their Indigenous roots. The 60 scoop resembles the current case in that the government's discrimination against those of Indigenous heritage, combined with their absolute power over citizens, lead to the displacement of Aboriginal children from their homes. This discrimination and abuse of power has not gone unnoticed. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was created in 1977 with the purpose of upholding the standard that is the Canadian Human Rights Act. This act states that all Canadians have the right to equality, equal opportunity, fair treatment, and an environment free of discrimination. With that being said, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal issued an order in January of 2016 to the provincial government of British Columbia. This order was issued on the case of their childcare spending model and how it is immoral and unjust. A second order was issued in 2017 on the same grounds due to the fact that the provincial government failed to oblige by the first set of instructions. Along with their lack of regard for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, the British Colombian government has failed to meet the expectation by another group. Established in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to life as a part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The Commission issued their 94 calls to action as a way for the Canadian government to reconcile its wrongdoings in the institutions that were residential schools. Among these calls to action was the action to reduce the amount of children in childcare. By upholding the current spending model, the British Columbian government is purposely dismissing these two reputable groups and could possibly encounter larger legal issues. In October of 2017, there was a settlement reached between the Government of Canada and the victims of the 60 scoop. Due to Canada's lack of intervention, the Canadian government will pay victims between $25,000 and $50,000 as a form of settlement for what they endured. Now with a former president, the British Columbian government is at risk of similar claims. After much deliberation and breakdown of the information given, I too am in agreement with Bernard Richard in that the current British Columbian child care spending model is discriminatory, unjust, and requires restructuring. The new spending model should allow for fluid funding movement based on where the funds are required. The movement should be based on the amount of children in care, which categories they reside, amongst other varying factors. In this presentation, we have gone through the case of the current British Columbian child care spending model and its flaws. We have identified the major parties involved, how this case holds historical context, and how this historical context, along with present legal instruments, can lead to major repercussions. Thank you for listening to my presentation.